What if I told you that the greatest business failures in history weren't accidents, but slow-motion train wrecks, visible from miles away? That the collapse of billion-dollar empires often starts not with a bang, but with a whisper, an ignored warning, a misplaced assumption, a fatal dose of arrogance disguised as confidence. Business isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's a battlefield, a chessboard, a high-stakes poker game where psychology and perception often outweigh logic and strategy. And yet, time and time again, the same mistakes play out like a script. Corporate greed masquerading as ambition, overconfidence steamrolling over caution, innovation killed not by competition, but by the ego of the very people who birthed it. There's a book, Business Adventures by John Brooks, that doesn't just recount history, it dissects it, peels back the layers of corporate triumph and tragedy to reveal the human impulses underneath. And what's shocking isn't the failures themselves, it's how eerily familiar they feel. Ford sinking $250 million into a car no one wanted? That's not just a blunder, it's the same blind faith in branding that led to the fall of Quibi, Google Glass, and the endless graveyard of tech flops. The stock market crash of 1962? Not an isolated event, but a perfect case study in why Tesla, GameStop, and Bitcoin have defied logic, riding the waves of mass hysteria instead of fundamentals. Xerox inventing the future of computing, then letting Apple and Microsoft steal it? It's a brutal reminder that the best ideas don't always win. The ones with the best timing and execution do. The real tragedy? These aren't just cautionary tales from a bygone era. They're happening right now, on Wall Street, in Silicon Valley, in boardrooms filled with executives making the same doomed decisions that ruined their predecessors. The only question is, will we finally learn, or are we doomed to repeat the cycle all over again? Arrogance is the silent assassin of great companies. It creeps in when success turns into entitlement, when confidence mutates into delusion, when a brand believes it is too big to fail. It convinces executives that their instincts are superior to market reality, that their reputation alone can dictate consumer behavior. And in the case of Ford's Edsel, that arrogance cost them $250 million, the equivalent of billions today, on a car that no one wanted. The Edsel wasn't just a failure, it was a catastrophe, a grand spectacle of miscalculation that should have served as a wake-up call for every company that followed. Instead, it became one of the most repeated mistakes in business history. Ford believed the Edsel would be a revolution. Market research had been conducted, focus groups assembled, and yet, the company executives had already made up their minds. This car was going to be a hit. Consumers didn't get to decide. The decision had already been made for them. The launch was massive, an over-the-top marketing frenzy, complete with a lavish unveiling on live television. But when the car finally hit the market, something horrifying happened. People hated it. The styling was bizarre, the quality was inconsistent, and the pricing, meant to target an untapped demographic, confused and alienated buyers. Ford's leadership was stunned. How could their golden child be such a spectacular failure? But the signs had been there all along. Internal reports warned of production issues. Early feedback from dealers was lukewarm at best. Consumers found the design ugly, the pricing illogical, the car itself unremarkable. But Ford pressed forward, blinded by its own sense of invincibility. If this sounds familiar, that's because it is. The ghosts of the Edsel haunt modern business disasters. Google Glass, Juicero, Quibi, Meta's grand but awkward foray into the metaverse. Each of these failures was fueled by the same corporate hubris, the idea that customers will love what they are told to love, that branding can substitute for genuine demand, that sheer corporate willpower can force a product into success. But the market doesn't care about ego. It doesn't care about legacy, prestige, or ambition. It only cares about one thing: value. And the moment a company forgets that, the moment they believe they dictate demand rather than respond to it, they are already on the road to failure. The lesson is brutal but simple. No business is too big to fail, no idea too brilliant to flop, and no brand too powerful to fall from grace. And yet, despite the wreckage of history, the same arrogance continues to claim new victims. The only question is, who's next? In business, reality doesn't always matter. Perception does. A company can have a solid balance sheet, a revolutionary product, even industry dominance. But if public confidence crumbles, so does everything else. Markets don't run on spreadsheets. They run on trust, fear, and momentum. And when that trust evaporates, even for a moment, the fall can be catastrophic. Take the stock market crash of 1962. There was no major economic disaster, no bank failures, no fundamental reason for markets to collapse. And yet, in a single day, over $20 billion vanished from the economy. Why? Because investors panicked. Rumors spread, uncertainty took hold, and what started as a small dip snowballed into a full-blown financial meltdown. The numbers didn't change, only the narrative did. Fast forward to today, and the same pattern repeats. Look at Tesla. In 2020, its stock price defied gravity, climbing nearly 700% in a year. Not because of its profits, they were relatively small at the time, but because people believed in the story of Tesla. They weren't investing in a car company, they were investing in the future, in Elon Musk, in the idea that Tesla was untouchable. Now flip that script, GameStop. A struggling brick-and-mortar retailer whose stock was essentially worthless until a Reddit army decided it wasn't. Wall Street had written GameStop off as dead, but a wave of retail traders created a new narrative. GameStop wasn't a dying company. It was a symbol of rebellion, a chance to humiliate hedge funds. And just like that, a stock that should have been worth pennies soared over 1,700% in weeks. These aren't business moves. They're psychological avalanches. The same mass hysteria that made Bitcoin skyrocket in 2021 is the same one that caused Enron to collapse overnight when the truth about its fraud was exposed. The lesson? Public perception can build a company and destroy it just as fast. You can have the best product in the world, but if consumers lose trust in your brand, your stock, or your leadership, it's over. Investors don't just buy stocks, they buy stories. Consumers don't just buy products, they buy identities. And once the market decides you're finished, no amount of logic will save you. So the question isn't whether perception matters, it's whether companies are prepared for when it inevitably turns against them. Because when the tide shifts, even the strongest can drown. Greed is a drug. It blinds, it numbs, it convinces even the smartest people that they are invincible. It's the whisper that says, just one more deal, just one more shortcut, no one will ever know. But in business, greed is a time bomb. It might tick quietly for years, even decades, but when it explodes, it takes everything with it. Take the General Electric price-fixing scandal. In the 1950s, GE executives had a problem. Intense competition was driving down profits. Instead of innovating or cutting costs, they found a faster solution, colluding with Westinghouse and other electrical companies to fix prices. They thought they were being clever. They thought they were too powerful to get caught. And for a while they were right. Profits soared, shareholders were happy, and executives padded their bonuses. But then, inevitably, the truth came out. The scandal became one of the biggest corporate fraud cases in history, leading to massive fines, criminal charges, and a public relations disaster. GE, once a symbol of American innovation, became a cautionary tale. If this sounds familiar, that's because it is. The same short-term greed that fueled GE's price-fixing scandal has destroyed companies again and again. Look at Enron, a Wall Street darling that seemed unstoppable. It wasn't just successful, it was redefining energy markets with financial wizardry that made investors drool. But behind the scenes, it was all smoke and mirrors. Executives weren't innovating. They were manipulating numbers, inflating profits, and hiding billions in debt. They weren't building a business, they were building a house of cards. And when it collapsed, it took $74 billion in shareholder wealth with it. Or take Theranos. Elizabeth Holmes promised a revolution in blood testing, except the technology never worked. Investors poured in $700 million, desperate to believe the hype. Patients were misdiagnosed, lives were put at risk, all because one company prioritized perception over reality. And when the fraud was exposed, Holmes became the face of one of the greatest corporate deceptions of all time. And now, FTX. Sam Bankman-Fried wasn't just running a crypto exchange, he was shaping an entire industry. He promised stability, trust, a financial revolution. But behind the curtain, billions in customer funds were being misused, funneled into risky bets and political donations. When the truth surfaced, the empire crumbled in days. The pattern is obvious. Short-term greed leads to long-term destruction. every single time. And yet people keep doing it. Why? Because greed is easy. It's easy to inflate numbers. It's easy to take shortcuts. It's easy to lie when the money is rolling in. But the market has a way of correcting itself. What's built on deception will eventually collapse under the weight of its own lies. It's not a question of if, only when. The next time a company seems too good to be true, ask yourself, is this real? Or is this just the next bomb waiting to go off? Business is war. The battlefield shifts, the weapons evolve, and the only rule that matters is this: adapt or die. The companies that survive aren't always the biggest, the strongest, or even the smartest. They're the ones that see the change before it happens, the ones that refuse to cling to the past while the future speeds toward them. And those that don't, they become relics. Case studies in what happens when arrogance blinds innovation. No story captures this better than Xerox. In the 1960s, Xerox wasn't just a company, it was a revolution. They created the photocopier, dominated the office equipment market, and built a brand so strong that Xerox became a verb. But what most people don't know is that Xerox didn't just invent the copy machine, they also invented the personal computer. Yes, before Apple, before Microsoft, before the tech giants that now rule the world, Xerox had the future in its hands. Inside their Palo Alto research center, engineers developed the first computer with a graphical user interface, a mouse, and window-based navigation. The entire blueprint for modern computing was sitting inside Xerox's labs years before Steve Jobs or Bill Gates ever touched a keyboard. And what did Xerox do with it? Nothing. They didn't see the potential. They were making billions on copiers. Why gamble on an unproven technology? And so, when Steve Jobs visited Xerox in 1979 and saw what they had created, he immediately understood what they didn't. Xerox had built the future, but didn't know how to use it. Apple did. Within a few years, Apple launched the Macintosh, Microsoft followed with Windows, and the computer revolution took off, without Xerox. A company that could have been the next IBM, the next Apple, the king of Silicon Valley, instead faded into irrelevance. Trapped in a business model that worked until it didn't. This isn't just history, it's a warning. Look at Blockbuster. In the early 2000s, they dominated the home entertainment market. They had the stores, the customers, the money. And then came a tiny, unknown company called Netflix. At the time, Netflix wasn't streaming, it was mailing DVDs. It was a joke to Blockbuster, a niche idea that would never work. Netflix even offered to sell itself to Blockbuster for $50 million. Blockbuster laughed. A decade later, Netflix was worth billions. Blockbuster was dead, or Kodak. They invented the digital camera. Let that sink in. The very technology that made them obsolete was created in their own labs. But instead of embracing it, they buried it, terrified that it would cannibalize their film business. And so, while Kodak clung to the past, digital photography took over the world, without them. The lesson is brutal, but it's simple. Evolve or be erased. No industry is safe. Not tech, not retail, not media. The biggest companies in the world right now, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, are powerful today, but if history has taught us anything, it's that power is temporary. The companies that will dominate the next decade aren't the ones that exist today. They're the ones being built right now, in garages, in dorm rooms, in places no one is paying attention to. Just like Apple was in 1976, just like Netflix was in 1997. The only question is, which companies will adapt and which ones will die? Being first doesn't mean being successful. It's a cruel irony of business that having the best idea at the wrong time is the same as having the wrong idea entirely. You can be a genius, a visionary, a decade ahead of your competition, but if the world isn't ready, you don't win. No story illustrates this better than Piggly Wiggly, the grocery store that should have made its founder, Clarence Saunders, a billionaire. Before Piggly Wiggly, grocery stores worked one way. Customers handed a shopping list to a clerk who went into the back and gathered the items. It was slow, inefficient, and outdated. So in 1916, Saunders had an idea: self-service shopping. He invented the first modern supermarket, complete with aisles, shopping carts, and checkout lines. It was a brilliant concept. It changed retail forever. And yet, Saunders himself went bankrupt. Why? Timing. The infrastructure wasn't in place. The supply chains, the consumer habits, even the financial backing needed to scale the idea. It was all too soon. Others learned from his model, improved it, and reaped the rewards. The supermarket industry became a multi-trillion-dollar business, but not for him. This isn't a one-off story. It happens again and again. Take Microsoft. They launched a tablet a full decade before the iPad. It was sleek, powerful, ahead of its time, and it flopped. The technology was there, but the market wasn't. Touchscreens weren't refined. Battery life was terrible. Consumers weren't ready to replace their laptops with tablets. Fast forward to 2010, Apple releases the iPad. Same concept, different timing. And suddenly, the world is ready. The App Store is thriving, mobile computing is second nature, and within weeks, the iPad dominates. Microsoft didn't fail because their product was bad. They failed because they were too early. Now look at cryptocurrency. Bitcoin launched in 2009. For years, it was seen as a niche experiment, a tech nerd's fantasy. Even in 2017, when Bitcoin hit $20,000, mainstream adoption still wasn't there. But by 2020, the timing was perfect. Institutional investors jumped in, governments started taking crypto seriously, and what was once dismissed as a fad became a trillion-dollar market. Timing is the most overlooked factor in success. Being first isn't enough. Having the best product isn't enough. The world has to be ready. The biggest winners in history aren't always the inventors. They're the ones who enter the market at the exact right moment. Facebook wasn't the first social network. MySpace and Friendster existed first, but Facebook came at the right time with a better model. Google wasn't the first search engine. Yahoo, AltaVista, and Ask Jeeves all came before. But Google arrived when the internet needed a more efficient way to navigate its growing complexity. So the question isn't just who's innovating, it's who's waiting for the right moment to strike. Because in business, a good idea too early is just as worthless as a bad one. A balance sheet can tell you if a company is profitable, but it won't tell you if it's going to survive. Numbers are clean, logical, predictable, but business isn't. Business is messy, emotional, unstable. Because at its core, business isn't just about products, profits, or strategy. It's about people, their fears, their ambitions, their greed, their blind spots. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the Texas Gulf sulfur insider trading case, one of the first corporate scandals to expose just how much human nature shapes business. It started in the early 1960s when Texas Gulf Sulfur, a mining company, made a massive copper discovery in Canada. This wasn't just any find, it was one of the largest mineral deposits ever uncovered. And the people who knew about it first? The company's executives. They saw an opportunity. Before the news was made public, they quietly started buying stock. They told friends, they tipped off family members. They didn't create value, they exploited information. When the announcement was finally made, stock prices exploded, and these executives made a killing. But there was one thing they didn't consider: perception. Once word got out, the scandal rocked Wall Street. Investors weren't just furious, they felt betrayed. The public backlash was immediate and brutal. The SEC stepped in, launching a high-profile lawsuit that resulted in landmark rulings against insider trading. These executives, once untouchable, were now criminals in the eyes of the market. And this is the part people miss. The company itself wasn't failing. It had made a legitimate discovery. It was making real money. But the people running it let human weakness take over. This same pattern repeats itself over and over again. Elizabeth Holmes wasn't just running a bad company. She was selling a lie, fueled by ambition that turned into deception. Sam Bankman-Fried didn't just mismanage FTX, he let hubris convince him that he could do whatever he wanted with other people's money. WeWork wasn't just a failed business model, it was Adam Neumann's unchecked ego that turned it into a train wreck. The biggest business collapses of our time aren't financial failures, they're human failures. Greed, arrogance, denial, desperation. A spreadsheet can't measure these things, but they are the true forces that determine whether companies live or die. That's why a brand's reputation is worth more than its revenue. It's why trust is a company's most valuable asset. Numbers might build a business, but people decide if it thrives or implodes. The question isn't just are the fundamentals strong, it's who's running the show. Because in the end, the difference between success and catastrophe isn't found on a balance sheet. It's found in human nature.